Welcome to episode 61 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode in the show notes at www.7, all spelled out, so SEVEN health.com/61.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel. This is another show where I'm sitting down with a guest, and this week's guest is Christy Harrison. Christy is a registered dietitian nutritionist and certified intuitive eating counselor based in Brooklyn, New York. She offers online intuitive eating courses and individual nutrition therapy to help people make peace with food and their body. Christy began her career as a journalist in 2003 and has written for and edited major publications including Gourmet, the Food Network, Slate, BuzzFeed, Modernist Cuisine, AllRecipes, and many others. And as an expert on nutrition and people's relationship with food, she's been quoted in top media outlets including Refinery29, Health, Men's Fitness, Bon Appetit, The Observer, and many more. She currently writes Refinery29's nutrition advice column called How to Eat and hosts Food Psych, a podcast that explores intuitive eating, health at every size, and body positivity. So in about November or December of 2014, I first began listening to podcasts. And I was having dinner with some friends, and one of the guys was talking about this show called Serial. And I'd known of podcasts and I'd followed certain music podcasts prior to that, but I don't think I'd ever listened to an interview podcast or a podcast show. But that weekend, my girlfriend and I started listening to Serial and we were both like completely hooked. We blasted through the whole first season in like 4 or 5 days and we're just blown away. And I remember thinking, this must have been what it was like prior to television and people like sitting around the radio and listening to things together and listening to shows. And whereas before that had never made much sense and felt like it wouldn't be very much fun, I now experienced how good it really could be. And so after this point, I really started getting into podcasts and just started listening more and more and started finding podcasts around health and disordered eating and body image and the kind of stuff I normally write about and work on with clients. And at some point, I discovered Christy Harrison's Food Psych. I think it was an episode she did with Isabel Fox and Duke, and I'm on Isabel's mailing list, and she sent out an email to say, I've been interviewed by Christy, you should listen to the show, attach the link. And I started listening to the episode. And what immediately struck me was just how good an interviewer Christy was and is. And now that I have my own show, I'm even more impressed by how much of a skill it is to ask great questions and to get the best out of guests. But even back then, before having this experience, I was aware of just how good she was in this role. And so over the last 18 months or so, I've been a big fan of Christy's work, whether it be via her podcast show, Food Psych, or her writing. And so I'm really excited to have her on the show today. So for this show, I really let Christy just tell her story. And I've had past shows with people recently like Anna Sophie Reinhardt and Lou Ulrich, where I've done a similar thing and just really let them go into a lot of detail about their experiences. And the feedback from these shows have both been really fantastic. Like, people loved hearing their stories and their backstory and how they got to where they are today. I was actually really gutted when I was recording this that we had to end the conversation where we did, because it really felt like we were just getting started and there was so much more I wanted to cover. Unfortunately, both of us had clients that we needed to get to, so we had to cut it when we did. But at some future point, I would probably like to do a round two, because Christy just has such a great way of talking about this stuff. She's got a lot of personal experience, both with working with clients and with the stuff that she's gone through. So yeah, I really enjoyed this show, and I know you will too. So the intro has gone on long enough. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Christy Harrison. Hey, Christy, welcome to the show.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me.
So, look, I am really excited to have you join me. Your podcast was probably one of the first podcasts I started listening of all podcasts. And I love the guests you have on your show, and I think you are an incredible interviewer. So I just wanted to start off by saying this because, yeah, I definitely learned a lot from you.
Thank you so much. That's really nice.
So to start with, I would like to borrow your first question that you always ask your guests, which is tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
Oh, yes. Well, great question, if I do say so myself. So my relationship with food growing up was fairly normal, I would say, which, of course, what is normal? But I think my family, like many families the world over, was a little bit concerned about their weight and what they ate. And there was a lot of diet talk in my family, but there wasn't actually any precedent for anyone being larger bodied or anything like that. It was like a bunch of small bodied people freaking out that they would become fat for no reason, basically. So that was sort of in the background and definitely would come out on holidays or when we went to restaurants. There would be a lot of sort of shame around oh my God, I ate too much. I'm going to have to do X, Y, and Z to make up for it. So that was instilled at a pretty young age. But in terms of my personal relationship with food, my parents, I think, did a pretty good job of just fostering intuitive eating, more or less. They always let me, eat when I was hungry. I was definitely encouraged to clean my plate sometimes, or eat the vegetables, or finish your vegetables before getting dessert, kind of thing. But there was never battles at the dinner table. So okay. I think sort of in that way, it was relatively normal. But there are just a few things that kind of stand out to me in childhood. One was that at one point we got a membership to Price Club, which is kind of like Costco. It's one of those big box stores where you can buy things in bulk. And we got a whole bunch of Reese's peanut butter cups, which is my favorite candy at the time. It still is one of my favorites. Yep. And so I was chowing down on Reese's every day. And one day my dad looks at me and he's like, "You better lay off those Reese's. You're getting a double chin." And I was just horrified. I was probably 6 or 7 years old. So that definitely stuck with me. That was sort of one kind of instilling of the fear of fat directly in me, because I had seen the fear of fat modeled around me, but to sort of point to my body and say, "You better watch out or you're going to get fat," or this thing that, I deem to be unsightly is happening to you, was kind of frightening. So that was one early kind of body image concern I had. And then we moved to a new town when I was 10 years old. And I was very shy and had a hard time making friends at first. And I was also the weird kid because we moved to this very affluent suburb from a sort of diverse, less affluent place, Oakland, California. So if any listeners know it, but we moved to a suburb that was super bougie and white. And so I was sort of the weirdo and I dressed weird and, people made fun of me and stuff. And so I started emotionally eating a little bit during that time. I started using food for comfort. So I didn't really have a ton of other coping skills other than watching TV. So I would watch TV for hours on end and I would make up weird food concoctions in the kitchen. So I would just take weird ingredients that we had lying around and sort of make something with them. And I would go back again and again and eat them. So that was kind of a strange moment in my relationship with food, but it really sort of passed after really was sort of happening most one summer. And then the school year started and I started making friends and it sort of passed that relationship with food. But the body shame caught back up with me in adolescence because most adolescent girls, I gained a little bit of weight in preparation to go through puberty. But I never gained, as fat as I thought in my mind. I had this image of myself like, oh my God, I'm getting so fat, like something's wrong with me, and it was just normal development and growth for puberty.
Which is so interesting, because I often talk with clients who tell me like how big they've always been, and then they say, I actually looked at pictures of myself when I was a kid and there was nothing wrong with me. And I was a very normal kid, but their experience at that time was, as you say, you feel like you're huge, you're enormous, whatever the adjective.
Right. There was no reason for it other than like this fear of fat that had been instilled in me from my family. And by the way, I'm using the term fat, I was critical of it at the time, but now I'm part of the fat acceptance movement and body positivity. So I sort of use that term neutrally now. Yeah. Just want to make that distinction because I don't want to offend anyone who's listening, but I'm super body positive. And I think of fat as, a body type that is just as normal as, thin or tall or short or whatever. So, yeah. But so anyway, I was like very judgmental of my body going through puberty. But thankfully, my family, while they had this fear of fat that they still applied to themselves, they were very reassuring of me. And, I think that's really thin privilege, honestly. Like the fact that they were like, no, you look great. You're fine. Like, we love you, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if that would have been different if I legitimately was larger. In my family, especially like the way that they related to larger bodies, I think I would have had a different experience if I had also been larger, but that wasn't the case, so I sort of was protected from that for my whole rest of my adolescence. And I had a lot of friends who were very supportive. And so I kind of didn't really, like, my relationship with food remained fairly normal until I went to college. And then, of course, like most people in college, things went a little bit off the rails in many different ways. So when I first got there, of course, it was just like, oh my God, all this food, and there's ice cream every night. And we had a dining hall it was basically just a buffet every night. They would have some different entree options that would rotate. But then there was, a salad bar that was always there. There was like all these different things that were just always there that you could go for again and again, or as much as you wanted while you were in the dining hall. So like all of us kind of took advantage of that, my friends and I. I think I was like, I wasn't eating super emotionally at that point. I was doing it just for fun and for pleasure mostly. But then I started to worry a little bit how it was affecting my body. And I also went on birth control for the first time my freshman year of college. So I definitely had some like self-consciousness and body image concerns then. But it didn't really fully rear its head until I went abroad to Paris for my junior year, which was a super fortunate thing to be able to do. And I feel so grateful for that experience. But one unfortunate kind of downside to it was that I went on a birth control pill that my gynecologist just had some samples of lying around. She's like, well, here's a year's worth of samples that you can take with you if you want to switch pills and go on this other pill. And I was like, great, free birth control, I'm sold. So I went on a different pill, and unfortunately that pill just had a very negative effect on my hormones. One side effect was that I gained a bunch of weight very quickly, but I also got really bad acne, and I was like sweating, and just, it was not a good fit with my body chemistry. Yeah. But I didn't realize at the time that it was that effect was from the pill, the weight gain. So it was the first time in my life that I ever gained a significant amount of weight in a short period of time. And I just didn't know what to do with myself. So now we're getting more into adulthood. And I don't know if you want to pause here, because this is like
this is all still really interesting, because I do know your story, and I want to go through all that. So it's great. I'm happy for you to continue on. I mean, one of the things I'm thinking of is, I know you've now studied as a registered dietitian, but back then, what were you originally studying when you went off to college and then were off in Paris?
Yeah, great question. So I was originally studying, I originally went in to study psychology. Okay. And then I got interested more. I was always wanted to be a writer. I had, like, since the time I could even talk, I was like dictating books to my parents, and I always thought I wanted to write books. So that sort of really got me in college. Like, I started working for the literary magazine there, and I was an editor. And so I decided I wanted to pursue a career in journalism. And we didn't have a journalism undergraduate major where I went. different. So I did rhetoric, which is like a critical theory sort of argumentation type of major. So I was doing that. And then I had this opportunity to go abroad to Paris and to take a double major in French. So I did that as well. So like rhetoric and French was what I was studying. And I went to this program in France that was basically rhetoric in French. It was like critical theory. It was called the Institute for Critical Studies. And it was part of the Sorbonne Nouvelle, which is like one of the Sorbonnes in Paris. So that's where I studied abroad, but it was through Berkeley, which is where I went to school, or went to undergrad. So so I was there like studying rhetoric and French basically, and was, immersed in like a lot of theory that sort of was tangentially related to feminist theory and gender studies. And, we thought a lot about those things in the context of whatever we were studying. So sometimes it was like politics or film or culture, but sort of looking at, all of those things with this lens of critical studies and theory. So I was like really exposed pretty early. And also my mom was a feminist in the 60s in Berkeley. She was sort of in the like early, second wave, I guess, of feminism. So I was very steeped in it. And yet I just, in Paris, gaining that amount of weight, which really wasn't that significant, but just fairly quick, and it made me not fit into my clothes anymore. I suddenly had all of this diet culture, like these years of diet culture that had been just sort of simmering in the background, really like leapt up to the fore for me. And I was like, I have to lose weight. Here's how I'm going to do it. And I just kind of like searched around on the internet and got some bad ideas and started restricting my food. And so at first it was like I lost some weight and people were complimenting me, and, my friends in Paris were like, oh, you look good, et cetera. And then I came home to the US and I went off that birth control pill because I think at the time I actually had decided, well, the birth control pill could be contributing to my weight gain, so I don't want to be on a pill anymore. Yep. But it was coming from a place, it wasn't coming from a place of like, oh, the birth control pill seems to be what made me gain this weight, so if I go off it, everything will be fine. It was like, I have to be as thin as possible, so I'm going to go off this birth control pill and keep doing these crazy things to lose weight, because I was already in the disordered mindset.
Because that was what I was going to say. Like, had that like switch already been like turned on while you were in Paris, and it had started to ramp up then in terms of the dieting and the restriction?
I think it was probably turned on then, because it didn't ramp up fully in terms of the dieting and restriction, because I was like, have to wait until I get home to switch birth control pills. I had a serious boyfriend at the time, so I wanted to be on birth control, but I was like, I have to wait until I get home to switch pills or go off the pill, and I'm going to figure that out then. But I think that it's probably contributing, so I'm going to stop, and I'm also going to do all these other things. So I was like planning it out while I was in Paris, and I think, I don't know, if someone had intervened then and been like, what you're doing is actually unhealthy and disordered, and here's kind of a better approach to food, maybe I would have been receptive then, but maybe not. Like, it's hard to say.
I think often people have to go through a level of pain or anguish or realization of this isn't working before they're ready to accept it. So maybe early on you probably would have been fairly dismissive and like, oh, okay, that might work for other people, or that might be a problem for others, but for me it's okay, or that level of thinking.
Yeah, and I also kind of think that I saw dieting as like this way to connect with other people, especially other women, that had never been shown to me before. And I had always felt a little uncomfortable in my skin and a little out of place. And it was like someone sort of flipped on a light and was like, this is the way to bond with people. This is the way to like, because I think diet talk is sort of between small talk and deep talk. It's like, it's something that you can get into with people you don't know very well. And then it somehow like leads to a deep place of, because really what you're talking about when you're talking about dieting, what we all want out of diets really is like to find acceptance, to find love, to be found attractive, to be told we're okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't think I consciously recognize that, or anyone really consciously recognizes that at first, but that is kind of what you're talking about. So it's like, it's this bridge between, small talk you can make at a party with someone you just met and like all these deeper hopes and dreams and common humanity that we share,
Definitely. I think it is that kind of safe vulnerability. And so many clients, again, when I'm chatting with them, they feel like when they get over dieting, they're like, but what do I chat with people at work about? Like, how do I connect with that person? Because they're always bringing this stuff up without sounding like I'm cutting them off or I don't want to be friends with them. And yeah, it really does put people in a tough position.
It's so hard. I think that, hopefully anti-diet talk will become the next diet talk at some point soon. And I do think that I've heard experiences from clients where they're becoming steeped in this stuff and they'll say just a little something to a friend about, like body positivity or whatever, and it actually brings them closer. So hopefully that is something people can use and that will just continue to grow. Yeah. But yeah, for now, it's like everybody just wants to talk about that stuff and it's so hard.
Yeah. And I think you, as the individual, need to be confident enough within yourself to then bring up that anti-diet talk. And I think people normally have to be a fair way along the process for that to work successfully, for it not to then just backfire and then they get triggered and it becomes something that they didn't want it to be and kind of blow up in their face.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because you have to sort of know how to refute things and also be comfortable doing that, because it does, when you first bring up anti-diet messaging to people who are really steeped in the diet mentality, it's kind of threatening. So Correct. They will lash out sometimes.
Yeah. But just then getting back to your story, and so you came back, you changed your birth control pill, and then what happened from there?
Yeah, so I went off that pill, and as I suspected, I dropped the weight fairly quickly, but I kept going. So I was like, I think back to my normal weight, and I wasn't really weighing myself at this point. I got very obsessed with the scale a little bit later, but at first I was just sort of judging by how my clothes fit or how my body looked, and I was like, oh, I think I'm back. But then it was already too late by that point. I wasn't like, okay, that's really what it was, and I can forget about this restrictive eating that I'm trying to do. I was already on the low carb train, which was happening at the time. Like Atkins was a big fad. South Beach was a big fad. This was back in like 2002. Yeah. So I got really on board with that. And I also was starting to exercise, which had always been like in childhood, that was actually something I had a very positive relationship with, was just movement and sports and, doing things for fun. But I started to relate to exercise in like a very instrumental way at this point. So not just for fun, but like to burn off calories, to, punish my body or make it look a certain way, basically. So all of that started happening, and within a couple of months, I lost my period. And, at first I was like, well, I went off birth control. It's, something's going on with my hormones. I'll just give it time to come back. Yeah. And kept going, hardcore with this restriction stuff. And I was, finding more and more ways to restrict. So not only the low carb stuff, but other, I'm not going to like say it just to not trigger anyone, but just, other restrictive things and rules that I was creating for myself about food. So, that went on for another couple months and I still didn't get my period. And then I was like, okay, something might actually be wrong here, because I had my period very consistently since I was 12. So I was like, this is very abnormal for me. And I did care about my health at that point, even though I was also doing a lot to undermine it. I wasn't thinking that it was that, So I went to a doctor. I went to my gynecologist, I think, and was like, I'm not getting my period. What's going on? So she ran some tests. She sent me to an endocrinologist who ran some tests. I think there was maybe another doctor in there somewhere, but I was seeing these specialists, and there was like an MRI to see if something was going on with my brain, like pituitary or anything like that. And of course, all those tests came back negative, and nobody my mom was the only person in this whole time to say, hey, I've noticed you lost some weight. I wonder if you stopped like restricting your food basically and regained some of the weight if you would get your period back. None of the doctors actually mentioned that. Like they looked at my weight that seemed normal. They didn't really know me from before, or they had known me, but weren't paying attention to my body size all throughout this time. And my weight had dropped for me a bit. It wasn't like significant enough to look like I had an eating disorder, which I think is, something I talk about a lot now, is the stereotype that like you have to be emaciated or skeletal to look like you have an eating disorder. And that's just not true. Like people of all sizes can have eating disorders, and they can be so missed because they don't fit the profile. So that was totally my case. I didn't fit the profile, but I was struggling. And not only did I have all these restrictions that I was following, but now I was starting to binge as well. So probably like 3 or 4 months into the restrictions, I started binging. And then the binges, I doubled down on the restrictions to try to control the binges, which of course made me binge more. So, by like 6-7 months into this, I was binging almost every night and not getting my period. And so, that it was kind of a wild goose chase for that whole year to figure out what was going on with me. And none of the doctors I saw had any answers, and none of them brought up the obvious, which I don't think I even would have acknowledged or allowed at the time. I think I was very defended against that.
And how defended against it were you when your mum brought it up? And was there anyone else apart from her bringing it up? I know you said when you were in Paris, part of the reason for not coming off the birth control pills because you were in a committed relationship or a serious relationship. Was that partner still around? Were they saying anything?
No. So actually, that's a great question. I think one of the factors, I don't talk about this a lot, but I think one of the factors that really contributed to the ramping up of my eating disorder was that I broke up with that partner when I got back from Paris fairly soon after, like a month or two.
Okay.
And I got into a really bad relationship after that. So the guy that I had been with when I was in Paris was, I had dated him for a lot of college, was super sweet, great guy. And then I was working at the literary magazine. I was an editor, and one of my fellow literary magazine people I started to like have a crush on and started dating about a month after breaking up with the previous boyfriend.
Okay.
And he had a lot of issues of his own. He had alcoholism, he was hypomanic depressive and unmedicated, and just like a lot of severe issues that I had never encountered before. And the relationship was very tumultuous and very difficult. And I didn't see that, I had picked someone who wasn't really emotionally available for a relationship. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could help him. I thought, the fights that we had were my fault. So it was pretty emotionally abusive. And I think that really contributed to my doubling down on the food restriction, because I felt like that was something I could control. Like it's so cliche, but it's so true. And when it manifests in your own life, sometimes you don't even recognize it. But it's like, that's exactly what happened for me, is that I was feeling very out of control in this relationship. And so, the food restrictions gave me a bit of a ballast. So that boyfriend was not helpful in addressing this stuff. I mean, he definitely, there were a few times actually where, I had tried to talk to people in my life about this, because my mom at first, when she said the thing about my weight, I was very defensive and I didn't want to hear it and I shut it down. But then a couple months later, I think because the binging was getting so out of control, that was the part that I was afraid of. That was the part that I felt like showed that I had an eating disorder or I had a problem. I wasn't seeing how the restricting was contributing to it. And I was hoping, like, if I can just get the binging under control, I can eat the way I want to, which was the restrictive way, and lose weight and be fine. That was my MO. So I opened up to my mom and I opened up to my roommate a little bit about the binges. I was like, I feel out of control around food. And, neither of them, I think because so many women have their own issues with food, really, like there's research showing 75% of women have disordered eating or an eating disorder. So I definitely think my mom was one of them, and my roommate was probably one of them too. I'm not sure, but both of them had their own stuff with food. So neither of them was particularly concerned or said anything about like getting help or anything like that specifically for the binges. And at one point, I think this was probably about close to a year into it, I purged for the first time. And I was sort of like horrified with myself. And I was like, I vowed to not do it again. I thought it was really, really bad. That was my sort of Rubicon. And I was horrified to have crossed it. Yeah. So then, but then, it happened again, like a few weeks or a month later. And so at that point I told my mom and I said, I think I might be bulimic. That was the term I used because that's all I could understand of, if you eat and then throw up, you must be quote unquote bulimic. Right. But I told my mom this. My mom is a therapist, but she's not a therapist who specializes in eating disorders. She's more general. Yeah. And so she doesn't actually have a lot of experience dealing with eating disorders, and at the time had even less sort of awareness of it. So I said, I've like had these binges continuing, and now I've thrown up, and I think I might be bulimic and I need help. And she was like, one swallow does not make spring, like you're just because you like very ironic way of putting it, and I was like, but it happened twice. It was not just once. And she was like, well, 2 swallows still don't make spring. Like, it doesn't mean you're bulimic just because you threw up a couple of times. But, maybe it's a good idea to switch therapists. She was helpful in that because I had been seeing a therapist during this time. And I had also tried to open up to that therapist who shut me down and basically was like, you're not thin enough to have an eating disorder. Like, that's essentially what she said to me. Which, for someone who has an eating disorder is like, I'll show you, I'll show you thin enough, and it just caused me to shut the door completely on wanting to open up to that therapist about it. And her approach, that therapist, was very, psychodynamic, which was sort of not what I needed, because psychodynamic therapy sort of really causes you to reflect deeply on your actions and your past and what you're doing. And like, for someone who's already very self-critical, I think it can add fuel to the fire of self-criticism, because it's the way that therapist approached me was sort of very neutral. And she was like, I wonder why. She was like, okay, what do you think that's about for you? That was her refrain. What do you think that's about for you? And like, that just felt so stigmatizing to me. I was like, oh my God, I'm broken. I'm the worst person, So my mom referred me to someone else who had a much more positive sort of cognitive behavioral approach to things, and was very validating of most of my experience just in life. She was sort of helpful in reducing my shame about myself in general. Okay. But when it came to the eating stuff, I also felt a little bit dismissed by her, because she said, oh, that's really like, so many people struggle with this. And she wanted to sort of be like, you're not alone. And I think she was trying to help me feel less broken and abnormal. She was trying to normalize it. But I think in normalizing it, it told me like, oh, you don't have a problem and you don't really need help with this, or, forget about it. You're not sick enough or something. Okay. So that was kind of my last attempt for a while to open up to any therapist about it. So I think from that point on, I actually met a guy who was a foodie, like a real food lover, a journalist. So by this point, it was 2003. I was starting to work in journalism, and I had an internship at this newspaper with a fellow journalist who was a foodie, and I had a huge crush on him, and I just wanted to impress him so much. So I decided to not let him see like the disordered stuff that I was doing with food, to not be restrictive when I was eating around him, and to seem really up for adventure, because he had a previous girlfriend that he talked about who was really up for adventure. And they went to all these restaurants, and they went and like reviewed places for the paper. And he had this identity already at the paper of like, this is the food guy. This is the guy you ask for restaurant recommendations, So that was actually super helpful. It
and
was
how,
kind of
like, when you were out with him, it sounds as though things were great, but what were the repercussions when you then got home? Was that then, oh my God, I can't believe what I've done, all of that? Or you were kind of okay with it because you really wanted to see where this relationship would go?
I think a little bit of both.
Okay.
A little bit of both. So yeah, it was definitely like, I remember on our first sort of unofficial date, we went out for pizza at this famous pizza place that was near my apartment at the time, Zachary's. And I was like obsessing over this meal and what I was going to do the rest of the day to compensate, blah, blah, blah. So like, for sure, it was, early on, I think it was a big issue. But as I got more comfortable in the relationship and started spending more time with him, there just really wasn't time for that. And I also, really wanted to like see where it would go. And I knew that I sort of had to walk the walk also. So the behaviors started to really decline, but the thoughts were absolutely still there. Like body shame was still huge. And this boyfriend was like so helpful to me, unbeknownst to him, because I didn't actually tell him about the food issues I had, but he had some of his own issues, and weight and body size was sort of a thing for him because he had been a fat kid and he had seen some stuff in his family around like fat shaming. So he praised my body sort of without realizing that my body was still sort of artificially thin. I was still restricting outside of eating with him because I wasn't fully honoring my hunger. So I would eat normal meals with him, but then I would skimp or skip or, do sort of a few things to compensate outside of being with him. So like, I still wasn't at my healthy body size. I still wasn't at a size that was natural for me. Okay. And so his sort of praising of my size specifically was really triggering. And he didn't know it again. So it's like, and I'm still friends with him and I've told him like years later about all of this stuff and we've talked about it. But like, at the time it was just two people kind of trying to get by, and I was really codependent. I was really just, so used to changing myself to fit whatever relationship I was in that I just did that here. And it had huge benefits to me in terms of kind of it was like exposure therapy to food, but it also had some negative repercussions because I wasn't really able to look at the issues. And I sort of I don't think I even acknowledged to myself that I was doing this, but I just kind of put it in a box. I was like, this disordered eating history is just going away in this box in a corner. And for now, I'm this cool foodie girlfriend that this guy really wants, And so that relationship lasted for about a year and a half. And after we broke up, I was sort of in crisis. Like because I moved to New York with him and I had a lot of, had some friends here from childhood who had grown up here and that I had known from just sort of our families were friends. But most of my friends or the people I really hung out with were his friends. So okay. I felt very adrift because when we broke up, I was like, oh my God, like 75% of my friends are gone, or whatever, because I can't like continue hanging out with these people. And I just felt like I had lost such a huge part of myself. I didn't really know who I was. So at that point, I got into therapy, and I found a great therapist who ended up being a real turning point for me with my relationship with food, but also just my relationship with myself and my ability to be myself and know who that was. But at the time, I just was going in for the breakup and the anxiety it was causing me. So she introduced me to some self-development work and helped me sort of dip a toe into the idea that I was a separate person, and I was, not like the fact that this guy had broken up with me did not make me bad or wrong, because that was the overwhelming feeling I had. And I think helped prevent me from going hardcore back into the eating disorder too, because... Did you start doing a bit of that, or like you would just, that didn't happen? I did a little bit. And actually, that is such a winding story with so many little parts, because I didn't mention before, but one of the manifestations of my eating disorder before getting into that relationship was that I became convinced that I was intolerant to gluten, that a gluten was the problem. And if I could cut out gluten, then I would stop having period problems. I would stop being anxious and depressed and having acne and all these things that were obviously caused by the eating disorder. But, I wanted to blame something else. So I had this whole goose chase with gluten back then, which I put aside when I was dating this guy. And then once we broke up, that definitely flared up again. I was like, okay, I got to really get to the bottom of this gluten thing. And
which is so interesting, because so many clients that I speak to, if it's not gluten, it's like, this is why I became vegetarian or vegan, or like so many people's like healthy eating in inverted commas is just hiding disordered eating.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And this was like back in 2004 or whatever, when like gluten-free wasn't even that popular yet. So I've just seen this crazy explosion of people who are going through very much what I did, in the subsequent years. But at the time it was kind of like underground and weird. So I was a weirdo for doing this, and I had to like really explain it to people. And I like ordered these cards online that you can like bring to restaurants that are printed in any language. And I was like, I have to avoid gluten. Like, so I definitely went down the rabbit hole with that again after that breakup. Yeah. And I became a food journalist. So I was, at the beginning of my career in journalism, totally obsessed with food because I was restricting it and because I was dating this guy who was a food person and I wanted to impress. And so that all kind of channeled me in the direction of covering food as my main beat. So I was writing about food already by the time we broke up, and I became sort of, at the magazine I was working for in New York now, it was like I was the resident food person. I was the person people would ask for restaurant recommendations, that like stuff like that. So I did have an identity staked on continuing to maintain that. Okay. And I also liked it. I think intellectually I got curious and excited about food, and that helped spur my recovery forward as well. So it was like kind of a little of everything at that point. I was like starting to do the self-development work, also writing about food more and more specialized, and convinced I had a gluten intolerance, and still binging. So like the restricting and binge cycle had never fully gone away. It was just a little sanctioned when I was with this guy, because we would have like big dinners together, or we would, go out for like a cupcake crawl or something like that. So we had like sort of, moments together that fit right in with my body's desire to eat a ton of food at once, because I was not really eating enough kind of space throughout the day. And I was still kind of afraid of snacks and stuff. So that really sort of ramped up again after this breakup too. So then like about a year of this goes by and I get into a new relationship, and now I'm like the food person in the relationship, and I'm sort of driving forward the seeking out of interesting foods and stuff like that, but also super obsessed with gluten. And then I apply for and get a job at Gourmet magazine, which is like, I had been writing about food from this like very political perspective up until this point, like organic foods and food, the production of food and its effect on the environment and stuff like that. And Gourmet was doing that and was the only major food magazine at the time to be doing that kind of writing. So I really respected and admired it, but also it was a food magazine. It was like a, beautiful, sort of lavish, like these gorgeous recipes and very, indulgent sort of food magazine. Yeah. So when I got a job there, I was like, oh crap, I have to really walk the walk now. I'm, working 40, 50, 60 hours a week sometimes with all these people who are real foodies. And I felt kind of like a poser. So I had to, again, sort of change myself to fit the environment and put aside, again, I was like, I can't tell anybody about this gluten stuff. I'm just going to put it on hold and just do my job here and try to be normal about food. So again, it kind of moved me forward in my recovery, but also resulted in me just putting stuff in a box and sort of thinking I'll deal with that later. But it really, working around food that much and being with people for so many meals of the day really brought up a lot of anxiety that I couldn't hide from my therapist anymore. Like I had to talk about it. So that was actually the first time that I brought up like, hey, I have this kind of bizarre thing about food. And it's really hard for me actually that I work at a food magazine. And for the first time, a therapist was like, oh, wow, tell me more about that. Like, that sounds painful. And just empathized and like opened the door and sort of was like, come on in, let's talk about this.
Cool.
And that was so healing for me because suddenly I could really explore all this stuff. And she gave it a name and she's like, it sounds like disordered eating. And that's very common, and, just kind of normalized it, but also gave me a sense that, yeah, you're not crazy, or, your experience is valid. And also this is common. So it was really what I needed to hear, because it was like, those were the two missing parts from every other therapist's reaction before. So that was like, I think, a huge step forward in the sort of dealing with the underlying issues around the eating. And, I really learned to not see my value as just hinging on my body or how perfect, quote unquote, I was with food. And I started to do the work on self-compassion, which was so missing from my life in general. I was so critical of myself and so hard on myself. So she introduced me to the concepts of self-compassion and mindfulness. And, I started doing yoga and meditation during this time too. And I just immersed myself in this world of, mindfulness and spirituality. And it was exactly what I needed. It really helped me to start seeing, how I related to myself in ways that weren't helpful. And I was talking with her about food, but I wasn't directly applying this knowledge to food yet. I was starting to think about it and starting to like open the door to that possibility. But, my therapist would have me like write down what I was thinking right before a binge. And I would be like, I'm so hungry. Oh, I'm so bad for being hungry. I've already eaten dinner. Why am I hungry? And so it was like, clearly looking back on it now, I'm like, oh, I was hungry and I was berating myself instead of just honoring my hunger. But I would bring these logs into her and I'd be like, yeah, I don't know what was going on for me. I was eating so emotionally. And like, I said, I'm hungry, but I know it's about something else. And she was kind of like, okay, just keep noticing that, and kind of just setting the stage for me to eventually discover intuitive eating, which I also, at this point, I feel like I'm like just rambling on and on. So please stop me if you...
That's fine. I think you have a very, very interesting story, and I wanted to chat with you about intuitive eating. So it's good that you've got to it. So like, how did that come about? How were you exposed to it? And also, what did you think about it when it was first brought up, or you first discovered it? Did it resonate? Did you take it on board? Or you're like, this is crazy, there's no way I can do this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a little bit of both. So during all of this, I worked at Gourmet for 2.5 years, and in the last 6 months to a year of that, we were all sort of hearing rumblings that they might be cutting the staff at the magazine, or there were going to be huge budget cuts to come. There were some rumors that they might, it's a Condé Nast, it was a Condé Nast property. And it was like, there were rumors that Condé Nast was going to shutter one of each magazine. So like one food magazine was going to go, one fashion magazine was going to go, and that was just sort of speculation. But I was like, oh my God, what if we're the food magazine that goes, and it turns out we were. So, okay. So during that sort of uncertain time, I started to really look at what I wanted for my future. And because I had been one of the last people hired, I was there for 2.5 years, but there were people who'd been there for 35 years. Okay. It was like a very sort of familial type of place that people never left. So I was like, well, last hired, first fired. I should probably kind of figure out a plan B. And I started to realize journalism was really changing at the time. This was like 2008, 2009, in the big financial crisis that we were having. So, a lot of magazines were getting shuttered. A lot of publishing models were sort of changing so that people were, magazines were going online, or media outlets were solely online and paying writers very little for, a lot of work.
Getting them to do it for free.
Yep, which is unfortunately what's going on now, and it's horrifying. But so it was sort of early days of that. And I was like, this just does not seem like a way to make a living anymore. And I was already working so hard. And, my salary at Gourmet was very fair, but I was kind of looking at these other available jobs being like, oh God, that seems crazy. I don't think I can live on that because it was so much lower. So Then I started to think about, well, what other industries could I potentially be a part of? And do I want to do something where I go back to freelancing? Because before Gourmet, I had been doing mostly freelance journalism. I was like, do I want to go back to freelancing and also have another career on the side and sort of do both? And I started looking into nutrition school because I was so obsessed with nutrition from all of my disordered eating. And I had been writing about that at Gourmet too. So like I was an editor and I mostly edited other people's writing, but I also wrote my own stuff. And my chosen beat was like food politics and nutrition. So I was really sort of immersed in like policy, and Michael Pollan was like my favorite person ever at the time.
When you were commenting earlier on some of the stuff that you wrote on, his name came to mind.
Mm-hmm. Yep, he was a huge influence on me, and definitely like, I read The Omnivore's Dilemma in a very vulnerable time for me because I was still pretty disordered about food at that point. So it really, I think Michael Pollan himself, side note, like I think he himself has actually a pretty balanced view of food, and is not as orthorexic as, a lot of his ideas are made out to be. But I, being in that mindset, really took his ideas and twisted them into something very restrictive. And it was like, oh my God, I can only buy local, sustainable, but also organic. But, it was like all these rules kind of multiplied in my head and then it made shopping a very difficult experience. I was spending hours in the grocery store. So that's not Michael Pollan's fault, but that's how I twisted his words, basically. And so that's, the kind of stuff I was covering at Gourmet. And that also made me really interested in food policy because I was like talking to people who are working in policy positions. And, I was reading about like the White House chef and how he was like making all these strides in, community gardening and organic sourcing and that sort of thing for the White House. So it was like, the seed was planted long ago, but it was sort of in the forefront of my mind, I guess, when I was at Gourmet, that I could potentially work in policy or potentially work one-on-one with clients to help them with their nutrition. And I didn't quite know what that would look like yet at the time. So I went back to school to get a master's of public health and a registered dietitian's license so that I could theoretically do both or have the opportunity to do both.
And did the working with individuals at that time, even though you probably couldn't envisage what it would be like, did it appeal to you? Did you think that could be me, or that was kind of just a backup if the other stuff didn't work?
I think it was appealing because, my mom's a therapist, and I've always, one of my dreams as a kid was to be a therapist too, because I wanted to like follow in her footsteps.
Okay.
And I've always had this sort of like helping, caretaking kind of role that I've fallen into with friends, and, I'm a good listener and that sort of thing. So, I think it kind of, that idea fit right in with what, with that side of my personality. And I wanted that. And my relationship history is so tied up with a lot of this too, because when I was at Gourmet, I was dating someone who was also depressive, like hypomanic depressive, unmedicated. And again, I got into this rescuer complex of like, I can make him happy, I can save him. And he sort of colluded in that too, because we were very happy at the beginning, but it rapidly went south, and it was very painful. And so when we broke up, I brought that all to my therapist and I talked with her about it, and I had done some research on my own, and I was like, is this codependency? Is that what we're talking about here? And she was like, yeah, kind of. Yeah. Like that's pretty much the dynamic that you were in, and this caretaking thing. And like, it really comes out in relationships when you pick partners who are very like emotionally unavailable because of their own stuff, and you think you can sort of rescue them and help them. So I kind of knew that was going on with my personality. And this relationship, actually, I was working with the guy at the time. He was a coworker, so I had to see him every day. And it was super painful, and I got kind of roped back into like being friends and getting back together and breaking up again, and like this really unhealthy dynamic where it was always about me caretaking him and him like not being able to give what I needed. So I knew that I wanted to overcome that, and I knew that I had this side of my personality that just really fit right into that was like wanted to help people, wanted to take care of people. So I think that also drove the decision to work with individuals, because I thought, like, I need an outlet for this, basically.
Yeah.
I need a place for this side of my personality to actually be useful, rather than, which I subsequently have realized also I have to keep in check with clients, because I can't just give either. I'm like so much better now about boundaries. But at the time I was like, this is a way to channel that aspect of my personality, which I think is so common for people in the helping profession. It's like that was a dynamic that was useful to us, or comfortable for us at some point in our past. And so we fall into that again with our career.
Yeah.
So I went back to school for kind of all those reasons. And while I was in school, so I had already done, had this sort of revelation with my therapist that I had disordered eating, and we were unearthing the reasons for that and working on self-compassion. And probably about a year into my graduate program, somewhere along the way, someone introduced me to the book Intuitive Eating.
Okay.
I don't know who, I don't know what class or what like footnote in something that I was reading it was, but the name really resonated with me, because it fit right in with a lot of the stuff I was doing in therapy, the self-compassion work and mindfulness. I was like, oh, intuitive eating, that seems cool. So I got the book and I started reading it, and I was like, oh, I can't do this. There are definitely a few like throw the book across the room moments, because I was like, yeah, that sounds nice, but come on, like, eat when you're hungry, like reject the diet mentality. What? I'm studying to be a nutritionist, but then I just kind of came back to it and gave it a chance. And I also had some experiences in school to become a nutritionist that really solidified for me, like, I was not going to try to change my body anymore. And like one kind of really salient one was that in our diet assessment and planning class, which you have to do to become a dietitian, we had to weigh ourselves and measure ourselves and like calculate what our ideal body weight was supposed to be, and then how our actual weight matched up with that. And we had to do this in a classroom full of everyone else who was doing this too. So there were like scales stationed around the room that you would weigh yourself on and write down your calculations and stuff. And it was, horrifying for anyone who has weight and body concerns, issues with their own body. So I was very triggered by this at first and was like, oh my God, the way I did the calculation at first, I was like, I'm supposed to weigh what I weighed in my eating disorder. What? Like, that's what it told me my ideal body weight was. And I was like, oh shit, did I just miss, sorry, I don't know if I can curse on here.
You can curse however much you want.
Awesome. All the time. So yeah, it was like, oh, did I totally miss the boat on something? Why am I supposed to weigh this? And I don't. And I feel like I'm being pretty healthy now in a way that I wasn't before. And, I was restricting my food so much and I still had a hard time with that. Like, what? So it really kind of threw me into turmoil. But then after a few days of mulling this over, I was just like, well, fuck that, because like, I'm never going to weigh that if that's what I weighed in my eating disorder, and then never before in my adult life did I ever weigh that. Like, I was pretty like normal about food before I went to France. And now I'm, in school for nutrition, and I feel like I've learned a thing or two, and I feel like I'm eating pretty balanced. So it's just not realistic to think that I would weigh that little. And I'm just going to throw out this idea that ideal body weight could be applied to me. And I also learned in that class that there's a lot of controversy over calculating ideal body weight anyway, which like at first I didn't let that sink in. And then after I started mulling this over, I was like, oh, right. And she also said that this thing of calculating ideal body weight is very hard to do accurately and controversial. And I'm sort of seeing that in myself. So I'm just going to let it go. And at that point, like, that's really when I decided, okay, I'm deleting my calorie tracker. So I still had a calorie tracker at that point, which I think came on the scene when I was in school for nutrition.
Yeah.
And I got rid of my scale, and I was like, I'm just done. I'm done pursuing a weight, because my body just seems to be doing what it's going to do, and I need to, honor that. So intuitive eating had sort of crept in there already. I don't know if at that point I went back and read the book more, or what the sort of step-by-step process actually was. But, sometimes ideas will just percolate for a while and then they just burst forward. So I think that's kind of what happened there. So yeah, that was really healing for me, because I was just like, I don't buy this. And then as I went on in school, I also, learned more and more about research methods and how to read a study and how to interpret study results in nutrition specifically. And I realized that a lot of the studies that people were basing weight loss recommendations on were not either were very small studies, were not really valid for, predicting what was going to happen in the general population, or were for a very specific population, like, elderly men with diabetes or something like that. So that's, again, not applicable to the general population. Or they were just correlational studies and not randomized controlled trials. And correlational studies basically say people in the population who, eat a certain way tend to be of a higher weight, or tend to be have lower rates of diabetes, or tend to be this or that, So, but there's so many factors that you can't control for. Like, why do those people, if they eat that way, does that mean that they have more money available to them to buy fruits and vegetables, for example? And higher socioeconomic status is associated with better health outcomes across the board. And separately, because I don't consider weight a health outcome, but separately, it's also associated with a lower body mass index, having a higher socioeconomic status. So, could that be explaining what was going on? And in a lot of my classes for public health, I realized, that seems to be the explanation for a lot of things is social inequality, socioeconomic inequality, rather than what someone is doing with their diet. And actually, diet and exercise are a pretty small fraction of, what determines people's health outcomes in general. So I think that really set the stage for the health at every size stuff, which I got into a little bit later, because I started to see wait, if we're basing recommendations for people on this research that actually doesn't show what it purports to show, why are we doing that? And what does the research actually say about weight and health and food? So that's kind of where I ended up. At the end of school, I also worked at the city Department of Health for a while, for 3 years, actually, while I was in school getting my dietitian's license and my master's. And I did some work there in community nutrition, where I was educating people at farmers markets in lower income neighborhoods about fruits and vegetables and how to cook them, but also what the health benefits were and all that stuff. And I started to see some people in those neighborhoods that would, come regularly to my talks, and I got to be friendly with them, and I talked to them about their sort of individual journeys. And some of them I realized were getting really obsessive about things and would really attach to things that I said. And in a way that I was oh, I don't know, that seems a little extreme, And so that really kind of set the stage for me too of wait, if someone's at a higher weight and they do these things that are very extreme and disordered, we say that that's, quote, good. But if someone at a lower weight to start with were to do those things, that would be disordered. And I was starting to recognize in my own history that I had disordered / full-blown eating disorder back in the day that went undiagnosed. And so I was just that cognitive dissonance became very clear. And so that, I think, informed where I went from there, because I became really interested in people's relationships with food more than just the policy that would, bring fruits and vegetables into the neighborhoods, or, these important things and great things that could also kind of be twisted sometimes into disordered ways of thinking by people who are vulnerable to that. So
when you started then working as a dietitian, were you doing much more just straight up normal dietitian stuff before you then shifted into working more exclusively with disordered eating?
Yeah. So, my journey was so winding because I went back to school kind of late. I was 28 when I went back to school, and I had to work full time for part of it and part time for part of it. So it took me 4.5 years to finish everything to become a dietitian. So I was working as just a nutritionist, not a dietitian, basically, for the city Department of Health. And that was very, very sort of general. It was Yeah, bringing fruits and vegetables into lower income neighborhoods was one project. Or I worked on, revamping menus for hospitals, for homeless shelters, for senior centers, for daycares, so all these different locations where it was like city property where they fed meals to people, helping to bring in more balanced meals and sort of have like food standards that they had to meet. So that was interesting work because it was like actually forced me to think about balance and think about also getting people enough calories. Like one project was I designed a menu for a juvenile justice facility where it's like young boys who are growing, who have like the highest energy needs of pretty much any population group on average. So it was like, how can we get more calories? How can we get more calories? In designing this menu, we had to really think about like these kids need a lot of food. And that was, I think, super helpful for me too, because, it helped kind of reframe calories from just like, ooh, scary, don't eat too many, to like, no, you need enough and here's how to do it. So that was kind of the starting point. But yeah, then when I went to get my license, like the way you do it in the US for dietitian's license is like you do the school, then you do an internship, which is like a supervised practice training for several months or a year, and then you take an exam. So after working at the Department of Health, I went back to do my licensing, or my supervised practice rather. So I did like 3-month rotation in a family health outpatient clinic, and then a 2-month rotation in an eating disorder center. And that's when I was really like, yeah, I would like to specialize in eating disorders. This seems like the work I'm meant to do, or, the spectrum of eating disorders, really. So disordered eating on over to full-blown eating disorders. So that's when I sort of really decided to specialize. And by the time I took the exam and got the license to be a quote unquote dietitian, I was actually already doing that work. So kind of was a winding path, but yeah, it started out more general and ended up being very specialized.
And one of the things I find with people who had a disordered eating, had an eating disorder, they get this real interest in food in one way or another. So some people want to be chefs, some people want to practice as a dietitian. And then over time, that interest in food really wanes because they get over their issue and then food isn't the big thing in their life anymore. Do you ever have that sense where you're like, maybe this isn't the thing for me anymore, and there's other things that you want to be doing, or you are still really passionate about this?
Yeah, in my personal life, I think food doesn't hold that much excitement for me anymore. Like, I still love it. I still get hungry and excited about what I'm going to eat when I'm hungry, but I'm so well fed. Like, I eat meals and snacks throughout the day. I never let myself get to like the ravenous point that I used to. So it really doesn't hold that much weight for me anymore. I'm just sort of like, oh, what's in the pantry? Let me just grab a snack, rather than like, oh, I need to go out and get like the best cupcake ever. And where am I going to go for this? And like spending hours planning it, it's like, who cares? Just grab a bar and move on. So that's, my relationship with food now definitely is much more practical, and there's still a lot of joy in it. And I still love like going out to new restaurants and trying different kinds of cuisine. But my favorite thing really is just sort of, going to someone's house and having them cook for me, or going to a taco joint or a Thai restaurant or a little hole in the wall that's like not too far out of the way, just something in the neighborhood that's cute and yummy food. And I can have a great conversation with my boyfriend or with my friends, because that's what, really matters about food, I think, is its power to connect us, and its power to nourish us and fuel us, for everything we need to do. So the fact that it tastes good is like a side benefit, and is evolutionarily like what it's supposed to do, because it makes us want to keep eating it and seeking it out. So of course it tastes good, but it's not like the taste is something I'm in pursuit of all the time anymore. So, for that, I definitely have so much less interest in food. I'm still very passionate about educating people about, how to have a healthy relationship with food. And I think I am so passionate about that because I see it now so much. It's like, someone else who was on my podcast, Erin Flores, a fellow dietitian, said it's kind of like the Matrix, where, you take the pill that allows you to see reality and then you can never go back. Yeah. So I feel like being recovered from all this stuff, now I see disordered eating everywhere and I hear it in the way people talk about food. And I think it's a social justice issue really to address this because it's so tied up in weight stigma, in body shame, in, stigmatizing larger bodies, which there is no scientific evidence for in terms of health. Like there's no actual obesity crisis, quote unquote, or obesity epidemic the way it's made out to be. So, to me, that's where the passion lies now, is like dispelling these myths, debunking the negative nutrition advice that's out there that's leading people down a disordered path. But, personally, in terms of like my relationship with food, I feel like it's very steady and kind of boring and nice, like it's comforting.
And is that like some of the stuff that you're working on with clients? Is a lot of it about things like thin privilege and unrealistic expectations and talking about as a social justice issue and getting them to understand those concepts? Is that a lot of the way that you're dealing with this stuff with clients?
Absolutely. Yeah, which I found so effective. And it's surprising because it's, when I first, because I do a podcast, well, you mentioned it, Food Psych. When I first started the podcast, it was more generally talking about people's relationships with food. The second season was specifically devoted to eating disorder recovery. And then I made the choice, the third season, to transition to talking about these concepts: health at every size, body positivity, weight stigma. And I was nervous in doing that because I felt like, people who have active eating disorders who listen to this, like that's so foreign to them. That's going to be so far from their experience, and they might chafe at that. And maybe I'm going to lose listeners. But it was actually the reverse. I actually gained a huge amount of listeners. And I've heard from so many people who said, your podcast is really helping me. I have an active eating disorder, but to hear that like weight stigma is a thing and this is a social justice issue gets me really fired up and gets me motivated to recover. So it's very cool because, and then through that, I've had a lot of clients. I do have a lot of clients come to me through the podcast. So through that, I've had more people come who have an eating disorder or have disordered eating, but also are really on board with this as a social justice issue and can see how it connects to their life. And, I think a lot of people who have disordered eating are very conscientious, very thoughtful people who want to do right. And so when they see and hear about injustice in the world, it fires them up because they're like, wait a minute, that's just the same as racism or sexism or homophobia. That's wrong. And we have to do something about it. So I found it very useful. Yeah.
And I think it's how people then realize this is part of the reason why I have this going on. Like I've talked about this before, it's like thin privilege cuts both ways. Like it's not great for someone who is bigger, but it's not great for someone who is slimmer because it's the fear of, but what if I turn into that person who's bigger?
Mm-hmm. Exactly, which I saw firsthand in my family. It was like we all had thin privilege, but we all were afraid of losing it. So, and I recognize that, in doing this work as someone with thin privilege, I have to be sort of open about that and say like, I think I get a lot less trolling and less like outright hostility online when I do my work than people in larger bodies who are doing the exact same thing.
Yeah.
But, I think that's more proof and more evidence that it's something we need to change.
Yeah, totally. And I think that definitely gets thrown at me sometimes where people are like, well, it's easy for you to say that because you're thin or like you have all of these other things going for you. And I'm like, well, that's like, I agree with you, but that's also not the point.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. It's not the point. And it's, just sort of the reality of the world we live in now, that may be true that for, people who have thin privilege, this work may be a little bit easier, but we have to work toward a world where that is not the case. And we have to, I think it really is an important issue in eating disorder recovery, and being able to be fully recovered is being secure and happy in your body, whatever size it ends up. And for people who are meant to have larger bodies, I think this work is so important because, you'll never be fully accepting and happy with your body if you're always thinking that it should be smaller. Yeah. Like it's just And I think that's why a lot of traditional eating disorder treatment is pretty ineffective, because a lot of traditional eating disorder treatment follows the weight stigmatizing approach. It's like for people with binge eating disorder, oh, did you really need to have that snack? Like, what was that about for you? You know, like sort of shaming people for their food choices under the guise that they should be eating less to lose weight, when, you know, the same, like a person in a smaller body who had anorexia, for example, it would be like, where's your snack? That's missing. You know, why aren't you doing this? Right. And so, you know, it's like, why is there this double standard here? We really need to work to, you know, refute that and break that down. And I think that I'm hoping that, you know, in the next decade or, you know, 50 years or whatever, all eating disorder treatment is health at every size, body positive treatment, because that's not the case now, and it really should be.
Yeah. So look, I want to be respectful of time, so I need to wrap this up. But before we go, where can people go to connect with you or find out more information? I'm going to put all the links that you mentioned in the show notes, but I know we've mentioned the podcast, but what about social or your website, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. So my website is ChristyHarrison.com. It's ChristyHarrison.com. So that's a good place to jump off and find the podcast and also more about me. And I do online courses in intuitive eating, which you can find there as well. And then social, I am Christy Harrison on Twitter, but the first I is a 1. Same with Instagram. So CHR1STY Harrison. And then on Facebook, you can find me at facebook.com/Christy Harrison Nutrition or facebook.com/Food Psych for the podcast.
Awesome. Well, look, thank you so much for coming on the show. As I said at the start, your podcast has had a big influence over me. I love your work and I love the message that you're putting out. So thank you for connecting today.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7, health.com.